The original founders, the Cypress Land Company, which we'll talk about next week, they provided the first part of the land. They just simply called it on a map burial ground. It's been expanded. Originally, I think it was like 10 acres, but it's been expanded. There's not much room left out here unless you have a family member that's, got a plot. But you'll notice that there's quite a bit of obstruction to mowing. They start mowing on Monday and they end on Friday, and then they go right back on Monday. And I've been told that only in the last short period of time are they allowed to use Roundup occasionally. For the most part, there's no Roundup being used. It's just got to be weed eaters and mowers. And so you'll see a lot of obstructions, and we'll point that out. So I always start here for a couple of reasons. Number one, this is a Celtic cross. This cross was commissioned in England by this gentleman here, Kennedy Douglas, Hiram Kennedy Douglas. And some of you have heard the name Kennedy Douglas because of the Art Center. Well, he was an Episcopal priest from Florence, and so he had seen the cross similar to this in England, and he commissioned it there, and it's 14 feet tall, weighs over 6,500 pounds. And then it was brought copied by a firm from Memphis and then brought and put up here. It's the largest Celtic cross in the area. You'll see small versions of it on stones around here. So what's the significance? Well, the significance is about maybe, some say 65%, maybe higher, of the population of the South prior to the Civil War was Celtic ancestry, Celtic stock. And of course, we know that the Celts were people from England, Ireland, and Scotland. And many of us have a misnomer in our history when you hear the term Scotch-Irish. Have you ever heard that term used in your family? Well, it implies what? If you think about it just without really deeply thinking, that there's a blend. Well, it's not. The Scots are Presbyterians, and the Irish were Catholic. And that doesn't mix. Not in that day and time. So what England did is England tried to calm down the Irish by bringing in the Scots. Boy, that was not a good deal. Because some of my ancestors were Scots, and I know some of them. So what they did is they offered land to the Scots, the Highlanders, if you will move to Ireland. Well, one of the places they moved was Belfast. You've heard of that. Yeah. And it just caused years of bloodshed. Only in my lifetime, only has it calmed down some. I remember 25, 30 years ago, bombs went off all the time around Belfast by the IRA and others. So what this caused was hundreds of years of agony. Well, as soon as some of these Scots could escape, they came to America. You say, well, they're Scots-Irish. No, they were born in Ireland, but they're Scots. Okay? So that's where many of them wound up, is here, around the area. So most of them settled between 1608 and 1697. That's about a 90-year period where England tried to do that. The greatest migration started in the 1630s to America. And from 1717 to 1770, we know for a fact that over 250,000 of them came to America. 250,000. That's my ancestors' period right there, the Wallaces. I know that they landed in Philadelphia sometime in the early 1760s and made their way into the Appalachians and down into Tennessee and then into Alabama. I've got relatives all over the Appalachians. There are a number of places named for the Wallaces all through Appalachia. So you have two different groups. You have the British Celts, who is Wales, Cornish, and the Bretons, and you have the Gaelic Celts, which is Ireland, Scotland, and the Isle of Man. It's that second group that hated England the most. particularly the Scots. So, real quickly, Hiram Kennedy Douglas, it is his family that gave us the fountain in the park, named for a nephew that died tragically. It is also his family that we have the Kennedy Douglas Arts Center. Those two houses there together donated to the city. We know this, that he is the closest thing that this town had to royalty. He was related to 16 royal families of Europe and 25th cousin to the late Queen Elizabeth. He was at her coronation in 54 or something. Just recently we saw that. So that's Hiram Kennedy Douglas. So let's move and just walk and talk about just the people and events. So I know all of you know of O'Neill Bridge. Well, did you know that until the Folsoms, the only two father-son governors were the O'Neills? General O'Neill, who we'll see his grave right back over there, and this is his son, Emmett. Well, you'll notice he served 2 terms, but the terms were 2-year terms, not 4-year terms. Okay? And notice, please, it says writer, orator, statesman. When you hear the word statesman, what comes to your mind? It has another connotation to me. It means someone who really was famous for what they did, caring for what they did. Most of the time today, you don't relate the word statesman to our politicians today, unfortunately. Alabama historians have said this may be Alabama's last statesman governor. Doesn't say a lot. Look at his last term in office was 1915. And look who we've had since then, who have not been qualified as, or as historically qualified as statesmen compared to some of these guys in the past. So let's go. Local attorney, his daughter was Anne Craig Construction. Local attorney, great statesman, great philanthropist. He was very active locally in helping people during the Great Depression. He and a number of other local men rented McFarland Bottom and opened it up for public garden so that poor people could plant food there and glean food there. You know, gleaning is an old biblical word. Word is he died in church, First Presbyterian Church, on Christmas Day. I don't, if that's true, it doesn't get a whole lot better than that. You know, that's pretty good. Abney, got a story?
Well, it's a funny story. He was in the Audubon Society with us, and he went on a field trip one time with us to a cedar glade.
Mm-hmm.
It was in the fall, and the grass was about this tall. And all of a sudden we saw him high-stepping it out of that grass, getting back to his Cadillac, because there was a snake. It jumped up and scared him. And I don't think his feet even touched the ground.
Well, what was he known for locally?
Wasn't it real estate?
Well, his family, he comes from a long line of owning some of the largest tracts of land in Lauderdale County. Now that's been broken up since. The bend of the river, right. We'll talk more about that when we get over to the founder of all that. But he was, if you saw him coming, what did he look like? He looked almost like a homeless person in a Cadillac.
Yeah, he wasn't very well kept.
Nope.
Last time I saw him, he was going through Hardee's.
And he would buy hamburgers on sale and put them in the refrigerator. I saw him one day there, and he waved at me and he said, "Hey, burgers are on sale, burgers are on sale." And at the time, he may have been one of the richest men in Florence. But what else is he known for? Secretly, he probably gave more money to empty stocking fund for feed children and to do Christmas work than anybody. Worked for Salvation Army, but he did not want it known. But that old car of his, full of, he'd take those hamburger wrappers, wad them up, and throw them in the back floorboard. He looked like a homeless person many times, but what a heart he had for people. This way, where there appears to be no one buried, but what I'm told is they have to probe in the ground with rods because there's so many unmarked graves out here, particularly down in a spot I'll show you. But if you'll come a little closer, I want you to see this grave. Last week we talked about the rich white man named Richard Rapier. This is his free black wife. James Rapier was the slave of Richard Rapier. Remember that? And then Richard Rapier freed him and he became a town barber. His wife, Susan, born in Baltimore, 25th December 1811, departed this life, Florence, Alabama, March 1841, so she's only 30 years old. And also with her are infant children, Jackson and Alexander, twins, died in childbirth. She had 4 other children, as far as we know, 4 others, with her husband. Now, what's odd, if you remember, Richard Rapier, the owner, or the slave, the owner of John Rapier, the father, her husband, was the richest white man in town, or one of them. And when he died, being a bachelor, he gave a lot of his estate to this family. Can you imagine in the 1830s and 1840s, the eyebrows raised when some of the richest people in town are black? So her husband later was freed. All of her children were free because Alabama antebellum law said the slaves earned their status through the mother, not the father. And the reason for that is why? Remember your history?
I guess primogeniture?
No.
No.
Many times, who was the father? The slave owner.
Oh, okay.
So many slave owners owned their own children. There was always this controversy about the Jeffersons. And for a number of years, nothing was ever said about that. There was a lot said. The black Jeffersons wanted to do DNA comparison, and finally, when they relented and the white Jeffersons did it, lo and behold, they're related. Yeah. Somewhere down the line, A. Jefferson went to the slave quarters. So, why is she here? Buried at a very odd angle. Notice everybody else is buried this way.
That was going to be my question. It's at a weird angle.
It's to let you know she's different.
Oh.
Bill McDonald says she is different, and that's why he wanted everybody to know it. The powers that be, he had enough money to put her here, but they turned her odd. With some quirky things that went on at one time, you know.
So you think her own family chose for her to be turned different, or the
Bill McDonald hinted to the fact that it was simply the powers that be.
Okay.
Now, her husband, acquired a slave woman later, a slave, and had more children through her, which meant that his children were his slaves. A former slave buys a slave woman and has more children, common law, through her. Now, one of their sons is James Rapier, who we'll talk about in the antebellum period. And then if you take the next class, we'll talk about him in the Reconstruction. He went on to become one of the few, very first black men to become members of the United States Congress during Reconstruction. Another of her sons served as an Army nurse with the Union Army during the Civil War and went on later to medical school to earn his degree at Michigan. So the Rapier men, I know 3 or 4 of their sons became quite prominent. But they had to leave Florence to get an education because there were no black schools here, not even for free black children. So John, the husband, sent his sons to his mother, who lived in Nashville. And there was a school for black children in Nashville. So this is Susan. Any question about her? Kind of strange, but
Are any of their descendants still living in Florence?
there are a couple of them we can find, but not with the name Rapier. There's a lady, I've got her in my notes, I'll run across her name in a minute, but she was a very prominent black entrepreneur. In fact, she was the first African-American woman to serve on the Chamber of Commerce. She owned a series of beauty shops in town and produced her own hair products for black women for a number of years. But she's a descendant through the Rapiers. Students out here up on the street. Because coffee's not very far and we would walk. And I would have them do different things. And one of the things I would have them do is a grave rubbing. You would take like butcher paper and charcoal. And look at this. This would make a great grave rubbing. Or this. So they would have to be a little more selective. They could put it in a scrapbook they were keeping. And then some of them had to do words they found on the tombstones and go back and look them up. Because a lot of the early graves are in Old English. Words we no longer use, and I'll point some of those out. Now, there are basically 2 or 3 kinds of stones here. You got headstones, which is it. They're here at the head of the grave, and oftentimes it's highly decorated. We are becoming more formal. This is a more modern one. This is marble, and it tarnishes with, and in granite does not tarnish as quickly. But notice there's a scroll here. Oftentimes that is representative of your life. It's rolled out. Then the information about you is written on it. Sometimes it's decorated. This is an open rose, which tells you this person led a pretty full life. Had it been in bud, they would have more than likely died young. This is ivy, which is a decorative thing. It has no religious meanings. But down here you got the crown and the cross, which is deeply religious. And being in the Bible Belt South, you will find 90% of most of what we're going to be seeing is religious overtones. Okay, so here is a footstone. Notice this looks new, and it is. After the Civil War, Confederate soldiers were considered traitors. And not until like the last 50 years has the War Department given them the status of U.S. veterans. So if you can go back and prove that your ancestors served in the Confederate Army and then provide the rank and whatever, and it can be verified, then you can receive from the War Department either a headstone or a footstone. And you will see these throughout the cemetery. They've been added in the last 20, 25 years. And that's what makes it look so different. So you've got headstones, you've got footstones, and then you've got tombs. These are modern versions of tombs. Been to New Orleans and seen the real tombs above ground? Yeah. Here they're standard burial, but you'll see it's a style. And you can see that it was not everybody had it, so it must come and go. But it also has a lot to do with money. And then you have monuments.
More money.
And then you look around the cemetery and you'll see where the money is. Look at the monuments. They're not on every grave. More money. So as we go, just think about some of these are just plain headstones, some are footstones, and some are monuments. So we're going to be talking more about that. And you may ask yourself, why? Well, the reason why is after the American Revolution, most of these men were paid in land, remember? So they went first to the nearest unsettled places like Tennessee, Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, and settled there. What we have here, since we were settled after the War of 1812, is we have a dominant War of 1812 group of burials because they got their land here as bounty land. Remember, you got land according to rank and time served. The higher your rank, the longer your service, you got more land. That's instead of cash, because they didn't have enough money to pay everybody. I know some of you are older like I am. You've heard of decoration days in cemeteries, where you would go and decorate relatives' graves. Well, I was drug out here to decorate graves as a little boy. And as a little boy, I'd prefer running around and looking at stuff. And one of the things I was amazed with is this thing. And if you'll come a little closer, it gets even a little more quirky. What does it look like to you? What?
A jail.
A jail?
Yeah.
You've heard of a crypt? You know, you see them a lot more in New Orleans and places like that. I've been to Brazil and Paraguay, and they bury a lot of their people in the crypts that are much larger, above ground. This is a family named Garibaldi, Greeks, who came to Florence, had a delicatessen, and he was a cobbler, had a shoe shop on Mobile. They had a home down by Bank Independent, down off of Pine, and they had one child, and she died very young. And this is in honor of her. When I was little, my sister was out here with me. There were little girls' toys in there. A little dinette set, a little bedroom with a doll, right in there. And for years, nobody knew who's buried here. There were no markers. Until some research was done by a person who was in this class. They will not allow now to come back and put a headstone, but they allow this brass plaque. There are 3 graves here. Mother, father, daughter. Garibaldi's. Weird. I was playing down there. Do you see that flag? That is, all of that area was Potter's Field. This is where a lot of the poor and indigent were buried, the homeless. So today, if they're going to bury somebody down there, they have to be very careful about digging, because they're liable to dig into 2 graves. The flag, if you go down there, there's a lot of very small markers. Confederate soldiers who died in the hospitals here or who died in the fighting around here are buried there. Many of them are buried right there. That's called Soldier's Rest. Just that one little spot. A couple of other things to point out. Look at this spot here with the iron fence around it. When I was little, and I know I haven't imagined this, there was more of that. And I'll show you more later. This is a total obstruction to keeping this cemetery cut. You see it? This is too. So when some of this stuff falls apart, they don't replace it. When that falls apart, they're not going to replace it. And why is it there? Alabama, along with most southern states, had a law called open range, which means if you lived here and you had pigs or you had horses or you had cattle, turn them out. You ever been around a horse or a cow in a cemetery or around a cemetery? They'll get up against these stones and rub and push them over. Not on purpose, but this is why if you go to plantations around here, you'll see most of the plantation graveyards inside a wall to keep the livestock away. So that's what that's for. And that's why we don't see a lot of it anymore, but I remember that one time there was more of it. Another style of tomb is that box right down there. See it? If you go to the John Coffey Cemetery out by the new Walmart, you'll see those. If you come to the Florence, the Forks of Cypress tour, there's a couple of those left. Not many. Vandals broke them up at the Forks. But that's just a style. Part of the tomb style, okay? So right over here, I want to show you a grave right here. This is Samuel Spencer Ives. You'll notice that he's got a Confederate footstone. And I want you to notice, if you would, that cross. Where have you seen that cross? It's similar to a Celtic cross in the way it's formed, but it's the Maltese cross, which went into the Crusades.
Oh, yeah.
All right? This is called the Confederate cross. And at one time, they marked Confederate soldiers' graves with a stand-up piece of metal with that flag. It was made, the whole thing was made out of that metal, and it would mark their graves. My wife and I were in Savannah, Georgia, and went to an antique store, and the woman had a box full of them for sale. And I went up to the store and I said, "Ma'am, those are stolen." "No, no, no." I said, "They belong on Confederate soldiers' graves. They're antiques for a reason. Those were given to the families to put at the foot of their grave." So somebody had gone out and brought them in and sold them to this woman. It was pretty tough. She had to go, I don't know what she did with them, but I'm going to tell you about this guy. Samuel Spencer Ives was eventually promoted to colonel from private all the way up, wounded 5 times in 1864 at the Battle of Franklin. And at the time of his death in 1917, he still had 9 bullets in him. Emmett O'Neill, who was governor up there, this was his chief of security. I'd want this guy on my side too. He's got 9 bullets in him. We also know that he served as the lock master at Lock 6 on the first Muscle Shoals Canal. What is they killing? That's Lock 6. This way. And you go back, one of my girls did some research, and there were 3 epidemics, one of which was a big measles and the influenza, World War I. And a lot of these children died from things that you and I are inoculated from, or inoculated for. Notice some of these graves are very highly ornate. Notice this one is shrouded as a sign of mourning, but it's tasseled. I mean, look how detailed that is. Here you have the cluster of flowers, and up here you have this vase or vase. Now, when it gets to be like that in Western civilization, at one time, the Greeks and some after that believed that your soul would go there until later. It's just decoration. But you'll notice even the vase is shrouded. So it's pretty highly ornate. Here at the cross, this one down here with the cross is a very interesting man, Desprez. Desprez was Dr. Louis Desprez. He was the son of a Dr. Desprez who was born, the father was born in Paris and educated in London. And then later they came to Tuscumbia. And the father of this man was instrumental in founding Our Lady of the Shoals Catholic Church, which was the first one in Tuscumbia. First one around here, actually. And William, the father, died during the yellow fever epidemic. And this gentleman here owned his own private hospital here in Florence. Hospitals were not public back then. And for the most part, if you didn't have any money, I'm sorry. That's just the way it went. Not like today. Woodman of the World is an insurance company that at one time sold cemetery. You could buy your funeral. Okay. And with it came a headstone. Those guys must have bought really the good policy. You look how big that thing is. And as we go around, you'll see others out here. There's one down there, a big one down there. And there's one there by that box. And here's that box again that looks more like a tomb. Now, right down there, there's one that looks like a bench or a table. Do you see that one? If you were to walk down there, the top looks just like this top. So what looks like, maybe the bottom got knocked around or something, and they put this more modern legs on it. Because that top, older than the bottom, looks out of place.
Or a tree knocked it over.
Could have been. Tree fell on it. We don't know. The Ashcraft family. Any coffee people here? Graduated coffee? Well, it was prior. You were in my class. I'm older. Dr. Mr. Captain Ashcraft was a science teacher at Coffee, math science. Yeah. And here, come and look at this. Unfortunately, they don't use a blower. You can see this real plain. You see that cross? It's on his foot. It's on his stone. He's a Confederate veteran. She was a member of the DA, Daughters of the Confederacy. And if you'll look at this, her grave has the original Confederate flag on it, not the stars and bars. Stars and bars is a battle flag. So notice he chose a more of an upright stone, his family did, to mark his grave. So walk right over here with us. Here's another one of those fences, partially up, partially down. Please.
What about the trees and things? Do you know when they were planted or how, or if there's a plan?
I don't think there was ever a plan per se that there would be a cedar tree right here.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of cedar trees were planted by the birds.
Yeah. You don't know if they ever had to like plan the trees?
I don't think they ever did something like what we would call a landscape design of this place. I don't think it ever was. And if you'll sit here and notice, if you had an aerial view, you'll notice it is hodgepodge. It's kind of, everybody's east and west up here on top, but notice how we go around this hill.
Lots of pine trees.
Yeah, lots of pines. But what we have is, on the opposite side, you see that little valley? There's a road down there. Many of the black people were buried over there because of segregation. Now that's been opened up today for anyone, but you'll find many black graves there. Plus, all along this lower part of this hill, there are a number of black families with graves down there. Come, let's go in here in this corner. The Bliss, this is pretty interesting. Florence drug owner Robert Louis Bliss was born in Bristol, England, and died here in Florence. His son, that's Robert Sr., he came to Florence in 1820 and settled first in New York, came to America, settled first in New York and then later in Florence. And his son would serve in the Confederate Army. And his son was Robert Jr., who rode with Nathan Bedford Forrest. And he, along with others, and we'll talk about the others in a few minutes, founded the First National Bank of Florence. So this is the Bliss corner right here. The story goes that he and his wife were separated but never formally divorced and lived in the same house. She downstairs and he upstairs. So when a visitor would come and knock on the door, Mrs. Bliss would go to the door and then she would yell upstairs, "Mr. Bliss, you have a visitor." Well, very cordially he'd say, "Well, thank you, Mrs. Bliss." And they said that's the way they lived out the rest of their lives, separate in the same house. Weird. Now you notice we're doing this number, and then all of a sudden we've got this number, right? We're on the knoll of this hill, and you'll notice that here there's a Simpson coat of arms. Many of the Simpsons that came from Scotland are here. So we know a couple of things. Many of them, from Ireland. We know that when I was doing some of my research in Southern history, I would run across a phrase that kind of baffled me, and I'll just give you what it said. It said Celtic Mafia. And I thought, well, wait a minute. You know, we've all heard of the Mafia. We're not talking about a bunch of bad guys. We're talking about a bunch of people that when they came to a city, they literally took it over. They became the store owners. They became the politicians. They became the who's who. They dominated wherever they went. And the Simpsons and the Jacksons and the Coffeys were those people. Ireland and Scotland, primarily. So John Simpson comes here from Tyrone, County Tyrone, Ireland. And one of his friends he made in Nashville was James Jackson, who would build the forks. We know that with James Jackson and Richard Rapier, the guy we mentioned, they built one of the very first houses of merchandise in Florence. They're the ones that erected some of the largest warehouses along the river out of brick. So we know this. It's 1825, he sold out his interest and returned to Ireland to marry his sweetheart, Margaret Patton, who lived in Belfast. He marries her and brings her here to America. And we know this, that over the period of time they had a number of children, and I think I told you from the diary of one of his sons who knew Chief Colbert. Remember the description he would give of Colbert when they came to shop at his father's store? This is that family. This is that family. Okay, so in 1843, John Simpson built a home on Court Street which was later purchased by James Irvin, who we'll talk about down here. And it was for years called the Irvin Place. And what is very unusual about that house today is it has two fronts. It fronts Pine and fronts Court. And we call it Colby Hall. It's owned by UNA. Well, originally that was the Simpson home. And then the Irvins purchased it, and on down the line, the Kings bought it later, so on and so forth, and then UNA gets it. It's named for a local woman who married a man who they moved to California. She died very tragically of cancer, and he gave back to the town that house in her honor. And UNA, he gave it to UNA. So, these are the Simpsons. Couple of things very quickly here. You'll notice if you go, here's one of the sons killed at Manassas. That's first Bull Run. And then unfortunately, very quickly, a couple years later, there was a second battle there called Second Bull Run. You ever heard the story about that? One of the real tragic things happened is this gentleman decided he would farm. He had a farm in Manassas. And so he had a great farm. Then the Civil War comes and they tear up his farm. They kill his livestock. They tore up his fields. And he barely recovered. And then the second battle occurred right near him, pretty much on the same land. So he said, that's it. He moved west to a place called Appomattox. And Lee surrendered in his living room to Grant. Weird story. Watch that documentary on the Civil War. McLean was his name. The McLean House in Appomattox. Weird, weird, weird. All right, so a couple of things real quickly. Notice the monument down there. The big tall monument in line with me. One of the things that you need that's interesting is that's, let me get my note. That is James Martin. James Martin was from Kentucky, and he comes here about 1821 or 22, and he opened up with a partner named Levi Cassidy a mill on Cypress Creek. And the road to get to his mill is called Cypress Mill Road, right there in North Florence. The Cassidy house is on one side of the road, and his house, Martin's Bound house, is on the opposite side. Right across. You walk off the hill, and their mill was right there. As they got a little richer, they built a second mill, and they built a third mill. The second mill, if you turn left there and go past the old WOWL television station, go to the four-way stop, turn left. Their first mill was on the right off the hill. You go down into that curved road that goes all the way around by the creek. Their second mill was there. And their third mill was over on Wildwood and Cypress, that subdivision. During the Civil War, those mills were burned in one night by the Union Army. Before the Civil War, he was regarded to be the best, biggest textile manufacturer in the entire South. The only place closer was Richmond. This is why it was targeted. The Union Army targeted it because they produced so much cloth for the Confederate Army. Okay? It was originally it was called Cassidy and Martin, and eventually they named it the Globe Factory Mills. Cassidy withdrew after that, and one of the partners came in was Alexander Donaldson Coffey, the son of John Coffey, who opened up. Their descendants of this man opened it up after the Civil War, opened up one mill, the one down on the big curved area at the creek, and it operated until about the 1920s. There are a couple of pictures I have of it, and then we see those in the second class. So, any questions about the Simpsons and who these people are? They're really a strange looking stone right back there. If you come right here, you'll see it, and I'll point it out. You don't have to come in here, but I'll show you this. Can you see this? What is that?
Angels?
It's an angel carrying them away. You don't see that a lot.
Must be in it.
Yeah. So you'll see it in some cemeteries and some of them, but go ahead.
Moved.
What now?
This has been moved.
It's probably been pushed over and or moved by something. I don't know what would have moved it. It's pretty heavy.
Yep. Stronger than me.
This way, please. This boundary line right here is the Wood family, and this is Alexander Wood. This is his monument, who was a War of 1812 soldier, fought under Coffee. Coffee and Andrew Jackson convinced him to come to Florence. This is the first mayor of Florence. When Florence was laid out, and you'll see that when you get a map, the street you call Wood Avenue was Market Street. It's renamed for him and his family. His house is still there on Wood Avenue, not far from UNA. You see the area below here? That's another section of the Woods. And the son, this man's son, William Basil Wood, that's his huge monument right there. He was a colonel in the Confederate Army and pastor of First Methodist Church downtown. And he's the reason why we had the first industrial revolution after the Civil War during Reconstruction in East Florence. He opened up a mill down there. Now, they had another son named Alexander Sterling Martin Wood, and his initials spell Sam. So his friends just call him Sam. He was a brigadier general in the Confederate Army and taught law at the University of Alabama prior to the war. And after the war, he went back to the university and taught there. Any Alabama grads other than me? Wood Hall.
Woods Home, yep.
Yep, you've been in there. I had classes there.
Yep.
Still there, named in his honor. And he's buried in the faculty cemetery.
Open air type of.
Yeah, but he's buried in the faculty cemetery. So Mrs. Wood, this man's wife, her ancestry was England. Her mother moved here from England and is buried somewhere in this plot. We're not sure where. And what's interesting is her name was Mary Nichols Evans, and she was baptized by John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist Church in England. So it's pretty interesting. This is a pretty historic family, okay? Over here. The gentleman over there that I told you had 9 bullets in his body was a colonel of the 9th Alabama. And one of my friends has written the history of that, Ronald Pettis, who used to be a teacher at Brooks, who now resides in Athens. He's written a history of the 9th Alabama. It's pretty interesting. I think you can buy it online or at maybe Books A Million. Most plantation owners were buried on their plantation. We've got about 4 or 5 that are buried here in the cemetery, and these are the Hoods. Now, the Hoods are unique in the sense that he was born in Ireland and a friend of James Jackson and a friend of Simpson. So it's what I told you, these guys knew each other. So they would, we would call them kind of a little groupie group of power brokers. Money, prestige, and position. And they were very, very proud of their Celtic background. So we know that James Hood was born in Ireland and moved to Philadelphia about 1803 or 4. And he married a Scottish woman named Mary Ann Chalmers. Now, I will tell you this, not all of the Irish are Catholic. Many of the Irish are Presbyterians. And many were under the Church of England. But predominantly it was Catholic. Now, Hood first moved outside of New Orleans. And the weather was so hot and swampy. And finally, James Jackson wrote a letter and said, why don't you come back up here? So he comes back to Lauderdale County, or comes to Lauderdale County, and builds a place in 1820 called Woodland. Hopefully, now I'm going to make my second phone call and I've got to beg, hopefully that's going to be one of our plantation stops. Today it's called Woodlawn. And this is the Hood plantation. It's out on the Waterloo Road across from the lovely downtown landfill. You would never know it's there. It's hidden. It's a beautiful place. So during the Civil War, before the war, Mr. Hood died. Mrs. Hood took her young grandsons, 2 grandsons, to Scotland so that they would not be drafted into the Confederate Army. She educated them in Scotland. After the war, she returned and was shocked that her plantation was still intact. And most of the servants were still there. Story goes, she rewarded the servants with land after they were freed because of the 13th Amendment. But what we want to know is this. The last Hood to live there was Rear Admiral John Hood, who was a graduate of the Naval Academy, and he is a survivor of the USS Maine. Remember that? The Maine blew up in Havana Harbor and was the impetus for us to declare war on Spain, which ticked off the Spanish-American War, where we got Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, etc., etc. We know today that that was probably done from a faulty boiler inside the ship, and it was not done by sabotage. Because had it been done from the outside, the metal would have been bent inside. But instead, the metal was bent from the inside out. However, that doesn't mean anything today. But Hood was one of the few admirals from the Spanish-American War to World War I. And the battleship USS Hood destroyer is named for him in his honor. And he's buried at Annapolis. So he's the last of the Hoods who lived there. And it's changed hands numerous times. Today it's owned by David and Faye Abramson, friends of mine and their family. I've known them forever, and hopefully I'm going to talk them into letting us come. We don't ever get to go in, but boy, it's a gorgeous place on the outside. This way, please. I stopped at this one because here's another example of born in County Down, Ireland. There's so many of these Irish guys here. All right, this is Campbell, and what we go is we go down the list, and you'll notice that he is married, his first wife died, he's married to Mary Coffey O'Neill, General Coffey's daughter, who was the widow of General O'Neill. So her first husband, General O'Neill, is buried up here. Her second husband, Campbell, is buried here, but she's buried up there. And her relatives said she was such a quiet woman and very refined that everybody in the family called her Whispering Mary. They said that's about the tone of her voice. Whispering Mary. You had to listen real close. So we'll talk more about that. And I said, what do you mean? He says, he's a politician. He said, so-and-so's politician and a just and honest man. He said, there's got to be two people in that grave. Heard of that or seen that? It's Hebrew. This is Alexander Falk. Rogers Department Store. This is the founding family. Mr. Rogers was born in Clarksville, Tennessee, and served in the Confederate Army, and comes to Florence, and his son opened up in 1895 Rogers Department Store. But it was not called Rogers Department Store. What was its first name? The Surprise Store. Mm-hmm. So it does not, and when they sold it out, it was the oldest continual family-owned department store in Alabama before it was sold, when they closed it. And the building's still downtown. Great building. So this is their plot. The Irvin family, very famous family with the large monument. Mr. Irvin was a Confederate veteran. He was a lawyer, and a lawyer for the Cypress Landing Company that founded Florence. When this man died, he was so popular that all the bells, they closed all the businesses and all the bells tolled for him when he died. He was extremely popular in the city. That whole plot are his descendants. Sue King Huffstedler, do anybody remember that name? That's her grave, that new grave right there. Yeah, she was a wonderful lady. She is a descendant of his. Another plantation family that's not buried on their plantation, they're buried here. This is him. You know, he's born in Virginia. Notice he dies 1856. His wife succeeded him. This is her. She gets him this. She gets that.
That's from her kids.
Yeah. But if you will read it, it says Janet Walker, relict of. R-E-L-I-C-T. That was one of those words my students, I said, you got to go look it up. Back there in The Simpsons, there was one, her name, I can't remember her name, but it said consort of. And my kids would go, it's back there. Ooh, I want to look that one up. Boy, they were disappointed. These are old English words that we no longer use, and my wife said, thankfully. Consort is wife of. Relict is widow of. So she is the widow of him. Okay? The Colliers. On around the corner. Notice this beautiful cross here. Robert Tennant Simpson, Judge Simpson, related to those Simpsons back there. Isn't that pretty? Isn't it a good day for a walk, isn't it?
It is.
You got to speed it up. Come on. Get your blood pumping. Let's go. Do any of you remember Elting branch of First National Bank? Used to be out on 72, across from Bowling Alley.
Where CVS is.
Yes. This is the co-founder of First National Bank along with Bliss. He was from New York and founded with one of the members of First Presbyterian Church downtown. And I'm told by members of that church that they gave an endowed fund that every holiday, and the holidays are listed, there must be fresh flowers here. On this, and I've been in here when there would be a bouquet of flowers sitting up there. And that fund, that perpetual fund, pays for the flowers. But you come in here, this is one of the first places you see. Okay, very prominent place. This grave right here behind you, many of us went last year when we went to the Todd. We went to Mapleton. Were some of you with us last year at the plantation tour? All right, this is the guy that lived in Mapleton. He was from Kentucky. He was a medical doctor, and he had two sisters that lived here with him that were never married. But the name Todd ought to ring for you. Mary Todd Lincoln. These are her family. The Todds were Kentuckians, and most of them had slaves. Can you imagine Abraham Lincoln running for president today with CNN and all that his wife's family are slaveholders? And her brothers fought for the Confederate Army? What a slap in the face. Don't you know about all the dirt they dig up? But this is Lincoln's wife's family. They were like cousins. Across the street, Armory was when I was growing up, and that's where a Confederate fort was guarding the Huntsville Road. That's the Huntsville Road. Florence to Huntsville, right? So that's the old fortress right there. Then down here where the Coliseum is where a fortress was guarding the shoals. Okay? One of the things I want to point out to you is see the big tall pine? And you'll notice to the left of there are three more modern-looking upright gravestones. See them? Yep. Those are three black men who fought in the Confederate Army. When I was working on my master's degree at Alabama, we were supposed to bring in local history material. Well, I talked about that, and the professor said there is no such thing as a black Confederate veteran. They were slaves. They were forced into service. Many of these men were actually slaves. That's true. But here's my argument. If you know Alabama the way I know Alabama, would Alabama pay a black man a stipend after the war if he had not served as a soldier? No. No. These men actually were gun toters. And there's quite a few of them been identified that got government, Alabama paid endowments, monthly or yearly, just like a white soldier got paid.
Same amount.
I don't know if it was the same amount according to rank. They were all privates or corporals. It could have been corporals.
Probably was the same because they probably didn't make it.
No, it was like, it's less than $100 a year.
Yeah, just going by the roster.
Yeah. So they were on the roster of serving in the military. So there were a few. My professor just still argued it. So that's okay. So I still got an A. Another thing I'd have my students do is we'd come out here and we'd talk a lot about what does the symbolism mean? Well, most of it's religious in nature, but look at this one. Anchor. And if you get up here and you read, he died in 1917. His last name was Byers. And it says, through the sycamore, the candle lights are gleaming along the banks of the river Tennessee. He's a steamboatman. He's a riverboatman. Pretty neat. This grave is unusual. You ever heard this name? Zen? No. Swedish. There were about 10 of these families that were brought here to work on the railroad. And they lived pretty much in the same area out on the Chisholm Road in an area called Jacksonburg. When I taught at Wilson for 1 year, I taught some of the descendants of the Zens. We had 3 communities in Lauderdale County that have foreign religious group connections. You have the Swedes here at Jacksonburg. You have St. Florian, which are the German Catholics, not Florine, Florian, I-A-N. And by the way, the man, Florian Rash, would be upset if you called him Florine. And then you had the Finnish community of Cloverdale. There were 20-something families that settled in Cloverdale when it was once called what? Rawhide, Alabama. And they thought, you know, we ought to change that name. So Cloverdale's a little, and the reason it was called Rawhide, do anybody remember? That's where you carried your hides to be tanned. Tan yards. And those tan yards were all burned in the Civil War because they were supplying leather to the Confederate Army for boots. So, all of that to say this here, but I want you to look out on the street. There's a historic marker to the meanest white man ever to live in Lauderdale County, Tom Clark. I do not recommend you to stop out there to read that historic marker as you drive by, but walk out there to read it. He was born in East Tennessee, and we know that he grew up in the community of Jacksonburg, out on Chisholm Road. And he and his brother were known by local authorities as po white trash. Lawless. Records as long as your arm. We think they were drafted or conscripted into the Confederate Army. Then they deserted and joined the Union Army. Then they deserted that. So they became outlaws at the end of the Civil War and preyed upon rich families who had no one at home to defend them. Plantation owners. People they personally had a grudge against. There's a book written about this lawless period called the Booger Saga. The Marshal, Blair, who caught Tom Clark and was in charge of him when they hanged him, was right up the road there. His monument's there. Well, one of the things we know, you've ever heard this wonderful Southern story. This is a great story of how Southern twist is. His trial, he bragged about killing over 20 people. And he basically said no one would ever run over Tom Clark. Well, during the night, a group of local people took him out of jail with the 2 men that were with him, and they hung him. They lynched him down on Tom Bigby Street. They brought him out here to bury him, and members supposedly from the city said, "You're not burying that trash in the cemetery with my relatives." So the story goes they buried him in a vacant lot over there somewhere. Well, there's another story that said no, they buried Tom Clark under Tennessee Street so everybody could run over him. Makes a good story, but it's not true. So I'll tell you the true story. Bill McDonald was in the library one day, and he related to this story to me. He said, I was sitting in the library doing some reading, and this gentleman walked up and introduced himself. And he said, I would like to invite you to a family reunion to speak. And Bill said, well, okay. Where and when? Because Bill's like me, if you're going to serve food, I'm for it. I'm there. They said, we're having the Clark family reunion. And Bill said, okay. He said, perhaps you don't understand. We're having the descendants of Tom Clark. And Bill said, what? He said, yeah. So he spoke at the thing that was held in Colbert County, and they carried him to a cemetery and showed him where Tom Clark was buried, because some of the relatives dug him up from over there and took him over there to be buried in an unmarked grave. In Tuscumbia. That's all I know. I said, how did the reunion go? He said, real good food. Real good food. This way. Sometimes, without knowing an individual, their grave can give you a hint about them. Look at this gentleman here. Somebody want to translate? Machinist. He's a machinist. He was killed in an accident on the second Muscle Shoals Canal. He was not from here, but they brought him up here to be buried, and they wanted you to know who he was. He's a machinist. Pretty neat. Yeah. Somebody thought a lot of him. You're right. Governor Patton. Now, this is not Governor Patton, but these are descendants or relatives of Governor Patton, who was governor of Alabama and the owner of Sweetwater Plantation. That's fallen into terrible condition. Governor Patton is buried in Huntsville. I don't know why, but most of his family, along with one of his sons killed at Shiloh, are buried on the plantation grounds. That's Sweetwater.
Where is that?
Sweetwater is off of 72, right above the Chevrolet dealership there. Okay. As you go up that hill, Sweetwater's off of that, it's out in those woods right there. For many, many years and no takers. A friend of mine who is in construction said it would take $2 million just to fix it up. But it's the home of an Alabama governor. And it's all brick. It's absolutely phenomenal. And I've been in it, had the privilege of being in it. Warren Pickett. Pickett was from Lawrence County, died in Leeton, but he was from Virginia. But here's the thing, he served in the Confederate Army. Later on the Florence, they then called it the commission, or basically it became known what is the city council. And he's the one who's given the credit with saving most of the big trees on the streets downtown, because it became a fad at one time to cut all the trees and just leave the city open. So what's unique about this, can you see anything different about this?
Is it metal?
Cast metal. Another fad that obviously didn't catch on. This is his wife. Notice there's something unusual, and I'm just going to rub. Can you see this? Can you see the narrow open gate? Narrow is the way, the Bible says. Wide is the road, but narrow the gate who entered the kingdom. Joseph Milner and his brother, this is Joseph here, His brother was Samuel. This is his one, his grave. They were from Leeds, England. Now the story goes, you pick your story. Sometimes you just, without doing a lot of research, you got to pick your story. One story says they moved the family to Florence, then took off for the California gold fields where they made money, returned back to Florence. Another story says no, they went first from England to the gold fields, made money, then come here. Pick your story, I don't know. He opens up a wool mill in what is today Green Hill, on a creek called Cowpen Creek. And it was a mill town, meaning that the factory was here and he built houses around the factory for his workers. He built a church for them that still stands, Milner Chapel Methodist Church, still there. His brother, Joseph, opens up a drugstore in town and was beloved. And in fact, the drugstore is called Milner Rushing today. And it's the oldest continuous drugstore by that name, Milner, in the state of Alabama. Still has that name to it. A friend of mine, John Lawson, owns it today. I think he has 3 different ones in town, and one in Muscle Shoals, I think. This Milner was tortured by Tom Clark also for his money. There were a number of people who were tortured by Clark before he was arrested and executed. This way. Of William Chisholm, and then Captain John Chisholm. And on John, this is a monument to him, he was captured at Gettysburg and died at Fort Delaware Prison. Probably buried there in an unmarked grave. But these are the descendants of John Chisholm, who was the businessman partner with Doublehead. Okay? And notice that one of the descendants of this man is Pocahontas Chisholm. John Roth and Pocahontas had one son, as far as we know. She died in England, is buried there. How many Pocahontases there are, I don't know, but there's one at the Fork Cemetery. Pocahontas Bowling Perkins. Zebulon Pike Morrison. Here's a good opportunity to talk about artists sign their name, right? And if you'll notice, this one is signed by, right in the left right-hand corner, by a gentleman named Eldred. During the Civil War, this Union Army comes through, Union detachment comes through here, and Eldred is with them. And he liked the area, found out that there was no stone cutter here, and when the war was over, he comes back here. And so a lot of the really nice monuments are his. He did for people while he was here, alive. Zebulon Pike Morrison was a local, just a great local entrepreneur. He had his own construction company. We know that his company built Wesleyan Hall on UNA campus. The one that looks like the fortress, that's the first building. We know that he built the mansion at the end of Court Street, everybody calls Courtview. He built that. We know that he built the girls' school building that sat where the downtown post office is. If you go in the downtown post office, go to the left, you'll see a mural on the wall of the building that was once there. It was a Presbyterian school for girls, young women. It was before women had colleges. So it was kind of a prep school for women that got them into their maybe late teens. But that school was set in that spot before the post office was built. We also know that he served as the town mortician. And there's a funeral home in an area called Morrison. Mm-hmm. Been around here a while. He also was mayor of Florence at one time. They used to call it the alderman, city alderman, before it was a commission. Come on up and look a little closer, because it gets weirder the closer you get. You got a knight's armor, you got swords crossed, and there's that cross you identified later as the Confederate cross. It appears in the Crusades. And then you'll notice within the skull and crossbones, there's a skull and crossbones on this side. No, there's a skull here and crossbones. And it says in Latin. Anybody read Latin?
In this sign we are victorious.
Or victorious. But another one says death, in this sign death. Oh. But I've also heard it both ways, in this sign victory. We know he's too young for the American Revolution. And he could not have, he's only born, see, in 1795. He would have been a very young man in the War of 1812, but he had the rank of captain, and he died after the Civil War, probably too old for service in the Civil War. So we think he either served in the War of 1812 or some of the Indian Wars afterwards, because he kept that rank till his death. But what is strange is, what is this? All right? I had a guy come out here with me the other day, and when I say the other day, and this is what I got back from him. These pictures he took here in the graveyard, and then he has, and then he took that one, and he has a picture of this one. And then he has a picture of this one. Because I couldn't find it. And he found it. So what is it?
No clue.
Yeah, it tells you on some of them. Pass them
I
around.
don't have that one yet.
Knights Templar.
Oh, there it is. Templar cross, not a Maltese cross.
It's the Templar cross.
Freemason.
This is where you've seen this, if
And
you
that's
remember.
They always wore those little plummy guys.
Well, that's the Masonic Lodge, guys.
Okay, but
The Freemasons they're a part of that. But if you remember the stories of the Knights Templar, these are the guys that are supposed to have what?
Holy Grail.
The Holy Grail. You know, that's always been the story. So this is one of the emblems of the Knights Templar. Now what we know is this man had a plantation down in the bend of the river. The Keys are very important people, and there's Key Cave down there. There's Key Cave National Wildlife Area. That's all down there. This is the relatives. Now, I don't know about that one, and I kind of doubt that one. You know, who's the guy that's been looking for it in all the movies?
It is a treasure.
Huh?
Indiana Jones.
Yeah, Indiana Jones. He didn't find it, so, you know.
well, he did, but it was supposed to be wood.
Yeah, well, whatever. Hollywood and the truth are sometimes nowhere near each other. So anyway, this is Keys. Oh, and I meant to point out, the Foster family that built the house on Court Street, right over there. George Washington Foster, a very wealthy planter. He's buried here. He had a plantation on the Gunwell Ford Road. Two more. Do you remember that grave, the Dabney?
Yeah.
Dabney inherited his land from this person, Perry. Frank Perry, from Tennessee. Did anybody ever heard this name before?
Yes.
What did you hear about him?
Something about Frank Crow and the Perrys. I don't know.
My relative told me he was actually Frank James.
Oh.
The descendants of this man just died laughing when I told them that. Yeah. One of the last descendants that remembered him died 3 or 4 years ago. She lived on Wood Avenue. The story goes, now he accumulated a lot of land. Largest single landowner in Lauderdale County at one time. He had an office upstairs above the Herald Printing on Pine Street across from the old Bell Telephone. One day a salesman comes to town, and this is way, way back because he rented a horse and buggy. And he pulled up in front of Mr. Perry's office, and he told the man on the street, he said, "I'll give you a dime if you'll hold my horse." And the guy said, "Okay." So he goes upstairs, and the secretary said, "Well, I'm sorry, he just stepped out." And she looked out the window and said, "Well, there he is holding somebody's horse." So the salesman goes downstairs, very apologetic. Mr. Perry, I'm sorry. He said, that's okay, but you're not getting your dime back. Supposedly a true story. So, the hand pointing down. Here are 3 examples. But you'll notice this is simply pointing to something. You see in the chain?
Yeah.
And you'll see the broken link that's about to take the broken link out. It's a symbol of death. But I have seen where it's just the finger pointing down. Nothing under it. The Rice family, Neander Rice. Neander Rice was a Republican before there was such things as Republicans. He was a Republican when Abraham Lincoln was president during the Civil War. You can imagine what he might have gone through locally. Later was during Reconstruction and after was mayor of Florence. He was mayor of Florence when they hanged Tom Clark. And some of the Rices that live in the Oakland area are descended through this man, Neander Rice. Okay? Come right here, please. Here's a great one. Anybody want to go for that one?
John Hancock?
No, I'm talking about the symbol.
Oh, the symbol.
So, it's a shock or a sheave when they would harvest and they would tie it in a bundle. And there's a song about it. Bringing in the sheaves. My sisters used to think it was bringing in the sheets. They would just sing at church, bringing in the sheets. They didn't know what a sheave was, but it's the harvest. Okay. Anybody from Gilbert School?
Went first grade there.
Mr. Gilbert. Superintendent of Education, Florence.
Must have been when they paid teachers.
Must have been what?
When they paid teachers.
That's when they actually paid teachers. Come over here. Don't get near this, okay? That's real rickety. That's an actual grave. But what I want to show you is here. One of the engineers that was charged with laying out the city of Florence was Ferdinand Sonona from Italy. He did such a good job that the Cypress Land Company gave him the honor of naming this place. So he named it after his hometown, Florence, Italy. He lived here. He had a delicatessen on the corner of Court and Tennessee Streets where he sold wine. He imported oysters, smoked oysters from New Orleans. And it was kind of a neat place. He lived, partial payment for his service was in land. And he had a house in the parking lot of what is today the downtown library. And before they built the library, they did an archaeological excavation of that lot and discovered a basement where there were stacked up empty, broken wine bottles, which pretty much tells you that was his house. His son died in infancy, buried here. His brother, John Baptiste, and if you will look at it, the only 30 years old and 7 months, it said resigned to a painful illness of dropsy. Any medical people?
Yeah. What? I'm sorry.
Dropsy,
Dropsy? That's lungs?
heart disease.
Okay.
And it says here, his brother Ferdinand gave him the memorial, said eternal memorial of fraternal affection, place this tomb on his cold remains. Now the reason they look new is because they were broken on the ground, they were broken. So the city took them because of who he was. They are restored somewhere. These are here in their place. Sonona and his family moved on to Memphis, where he is buried there. But he is considered one of the early founders of Florence. And there's a street name for him over here by the UNA field called Sonona Avenue. Come this way. Here's one of my favorite. And your mother says, pick up your shoes and socks. Just little shoes and little socks. He's only about 4. Here in this corner are 2 families that are pretty important locally. But the Whitakers, but here's the most famous ones right here. The Bellamys. 1, 2, 3 graves. The Bellamys came from Atlanta area. Dr. Bellamy, his father, he and his father opened a company called the Florence Wagon Works over on what we today call Veterans Drive. Then it was Spring Street back then. And that was the second largest wagon manufacturer next to Studebaker in America all the way up into and past World War I. So they sold more wagons than anybody except Studebaker. Studebaker was considered to be like the Cadillac, and this group here was the Ford Chevrolet Dodge. Common man's wagon. If you want to see one, go to Pope's Tavern. There's one in the backyard. Restored. This way. Oh, Lake Tate. Tate Springs. Tate Springs is a very historic place in Lauderdale County. And don't forget, the Tate's wife was half Cherokee.
I thought he was too.
Well, he's descended through her. He was like an 8th. Just talking about the original Tate.
Okay.
His great-grandfather married a half Cherokee woman. One of Doublehead's descendants. And he proudly claimed that, Lake Tate did. He was very proud of that. This way. Particular grave, it's very interesting. This is Florence Barr. You'll notice his initials are in this book. Sometimes the book represents the Bible. I've seen listed on the outside of that Holy Bible, but it's got his initials, which probably is symbolic of his life. The urn is decorated. Notice somebody's put Mardi Gras bees on the urn. Over here, you see a partially opened rose. He's only, what, 23 when he died? Notice what's on the other side. His cat and dog are carved on the other side. Kind of strange. One of the most, if not the most ornate monument in the entire cemetery. Now, not being a military person nor a veteran, I've been told by a lot of military people and veterans that you could walk through here and know automatically this man's a soldier. You'll notice that it's shrouded in mourning and his sword is hanging there. See it? And you'll notice this is an obelisk, right? But notice that's a column. That's an antebellum house column, see it? And notice it's broken deliberately at the top to symbolize the tragedy of the war. After the war, there began to be a group of historians who began to write about the just cause of the Confederacy, and they called it the lost cause. So for years, there was all this lost cause literature that was produced. This theory came out of Vanderbilt, and the defenders of this were mainly Vanderbilt professors. We know that this is his, if you look at that, that is his grave face. They put this wax over his face in death. That's what he looked like. I've seen, supposedly the Lincoln Memorial is done with a wax mold of Lincoln's face. The same thing with George Washington. The same thing with Robert E. Lee. So families that wanted a true resemblance could afford to have that done. Now, 2 things over here that I have not noticed. You see those big new stones right there? Fairly new. They have been moved a little bit right there. But notice his wife is down here on the ground beside him over there on that side. And so this is General O'Neill, Governor O'Neill. His son is Emmett, whose grave is right over there, see? Yep. These Kennedys here are the descendants of the Kennedys, like over here, and the gun factory people. There was a gun factory in Green Hill on Cowpen Creek, known as the Kennedy factory. And if you ever go to Pope's Tavern, there is a Kennedy long rifle hanging over the fireplace. A Kentucky long rifle made by the Kennedys. Okay, a couple of other places and we're out of here. McFarland. McFarland was a Confederate officer and a lawyer. He did not build Mapleton, but he's one of the last owners of Mapleton. Well, he was an owner after the Civil War. And it's, he was, because he owned it during the Civil War when the Union Army, and by the way, a lot of this is true to an extent. Okay, here we go. When the Union Army would take over a town, they knew who the officers were of the Confederate Army who are from that town. And they went out of their way to deliberately mistreat their families. Now, not physically, but take over their homes, kick them onto the street. So the McFarland home was occupied over and over and over every time the Union Army would come through. As was General O'Neill's family home. Mrs. O'Neill feared for her life because at night drunken soldiers twice would come through her house, rummaging through the home. She took her children and went into Freedom Hills area of what is today Colbert County, where relatives were living. And when she got back, she didn't know if her house would be even standing after the war. That house is on Court Street still today. So this is McFarland. Here is Judge Simpson, Judge Robert Tennant Simpson, excuse me. First person from Florence to graduate from Princeton. Okay, descendant of the Simpsons over here. Isn't that a beautiful stone?
Oh, yeah.
Notice it's an Eldred in the right-hand corner.
That's marble.
This is pure marble. It's been cleaned. If you'd have been here a year ago, it was kind of dark, kind of like this over here. But someone has cleaned it and done a very good job. You'll notice this angelic figure is carving her name. This is the best angel we have, carved angel we have in the cemetery. If you really want to go see a gorgeous one, go to the Tuscumbia City Cemetery to see the life-size angel. She's beautiful. Then, note the grave down here with the woman with the anchor. You can wander down there, it's interesting, but you'll also notice there's something very unusual about that. What's a woman doing facing west in Florence, Alabama, holding an anchor? What's she doing? River's here.
Oh no. Facing the sunset?
She's facing west.
Facing west.
This is Eldred's wife. You'll notice the top is marble and the bottom is granite. I, with a number of others, think it was added later. Maybe it was found at his shop and just put on there. He's buried in Chattanooga in the National Military Cemetery. He's a Union veteran. Nowadays, the wife can be buried with her husband in that cemetery, in all the national cemeteries, but not at one time. So this is Eldred's widow. But have you ever been to Savannah, Georgia? And looking out to sea is a woman looks like that, holding an anchor, waiting for the men to return by water. That's what she looks like she ought to be doing. Down in McFarland, maybe looking out to the river. I don't know, but it's kind of odd here. Okay, we're out. Come on up this way. Plantation families buried in the cemetery, the Cunninghams. The Cunningham plantation was near Rogersville, near Blue Water Creek. Not far from Elgin, maybe. But it was on this side of Blue Water. Story goes that the Union soldiers came to the plantation and had dinner that night with the Cunninghams, and one of the soldiers, this was handed down through the family, one of the soldiers saw a piano and asked whose piano was it, and Mrs. Cunningham said it was hers. And basically they said, well, would you play for us? And they said she got up politely and started to walk upstairs and said this: you can come into my house, you can take over my farm, and you can eat my food, but you cannot make me play for you. And she went to bed. That resistance to the end. Here's the Thompson family. Their plantation was over at Pride in Colbert County, and they're buried here. But notice, as a symbol of resistance, do you not see this? There's that cross. And look in the middle of that cross. Do you see it? There's a battle flag. Lieutenant Colonel, the 10th Tennessee Regiment. Some of them died in resistance, you know. Okay, we are on the way out to the exact same place we entered. Hope you all had a good afternoon. Come on, this way.
As usual, Harry.
Thank you, buddy.